The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we're going to talk about the aspects of personality. Personality is one of the topics that most interest, especially introductory students. Personality is something that you will deal with a whole lot, particularly now in your initial coursework, and also later on when you become a practitioner. It's going to be an immense part of your career. So today we're going to talk about what is personality and how different schools of thought in psychology view personality. So let's get started. Now, because we are good researchers here, we always have to define our terms, right? We always have to define our terms. And what is personality exactly? I feel like everybody knows what personality is until I ask you to define it, right? Now, what is personality? Personality is a unique set of characteristics that you have. It's a unique set of characteristics that are generally consistent with your behavior. Generally, personality is relatively stable, right? It's relatively consistent, right? So for example, if you have been an extroverted child, chances are you're going to be an extroverted adolescent and an extroverted adult and an elderly individual, a person of age. So notice that one of the things about personality is that it remains consistent over time. Now, it also remains consistent across situations, right? So for example, if you are extroverted at a party, I could expect that you're also extroverted in a classroom, right? That you're extroverted with your family, right? Because remember, personality is a set of consistent traits, right? And I can observe it through your behavior. Another characteristic of personality is that it allows to explain behavioral differences, right? Behavioral differences across a wide variety of people that are expected and are being exposed to the same situation. What does that mean in plain English, right? So because of your personality, right, or in my case, I argue it has an awful lot to do with my training, but moving along. So an example that I like to provide to some of my patients in practice is that, say, if this office, right, where I work under supervision, say if my office were to catch on fire, right? Some of you, because of personality traits, like to be a protector, right? So you may grab someone, right? You may grab the person next to you and try to take off, right? So for example, if this classroom were to catch on fire, some of you may try to be a protector and grab this person and take off. Some of you may go towards the fire, right? And find a fire extinguisher, find some water, right? To extinguish that fire. And notice that we can use personality to explain those different behaviors in the same situation. So any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. I like to think about personality as what informs your behavior, right? So if you're extroverted, I can expect you to behave a certain way. So some of you might have heard personality. Some of you might have heard you have these traits, right? You have narcissistic traits. You have psychopathic traits, right? Might have heard that before. But what exactly is a personality trait? A personality trait. It's basically just in the sense of being consistent. Notice that it's also durable. It is a disposition to behave a certain way. You are disposed to behave in a certain way in a wide variety of situations, right? So think about the characteristics that make you you, right? So for example, I consider myself to be immensely extroverted. I consider myself to be immensely analytical. So those are traits that I have. In them by themselves don't necessarily involve a personality, but all of them together could inform my behavior later on. Now, how do we conduct this analysis, right? For those of you who are still in entry-level courses, you may not be familiar with this, although when you start taking some of your more advanced classes, for example, statistics, math, research, experimental psychology, you're going to come across a specific statistical analysis that we call factor analysis. A factor analysis, it's simply a statistical procedure. It's a statistical analysis based on correlation. So let me make that very clear. It's a correlational analysis in which what we're trying to do is link a variety of different variables and identify if any of those clusters are indeed related. What does that mean in a very basic sense? What I'm trying to do is, one of the questions that I've been asked very frequently, both in forensic practice and general outpatient practice, is what makes a rapist, right? That's a factor, a question that I get asked quite often. How do we know that a person is going to conduct a sexual assault? Well, one of the things that we can do is a factor analysis, right? And we can start looking into traits and variables that we would consider that could engage in predictability. And you guys have been exposed to correlations before, although this is not a research class or a statistics class. But notice that a correlation is simply a relationship, it's simply a link. It doesn't necessarily mean cause. So what we could do is find traits that we have identified previously that could perhaps be related to a behavior, so for example, a sexual assault, and try linking the behavior to another and see if there's a statistical significance and variability when it comes to predicting that behavior. The problem with that is that behavior is not as clean cut, right? Behavior is not as clean cut as you would imagine. So for example, an individual is up for parole and we do a risk assessment to see if this individual, it could be a risk to society. And notice that you're never going to find a practitioner that will say, yes, this person is going to sexually assault again, or no, this person is not going to sexually assault again. That is because we simply cannot do that, right? Statistical analysis can only take you so far because it doesn't necessarily imply causation. So in order to predict behavior based on traits, we can utilize factor analysis. Now, any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. Fantastic. Let's revert back to our slides. Now, interestingly, in regards to all the approaches that we have in understanding personality, we generally assume that people do have basic traits, right? We do have basic traits, and some of those we are going to cover in our lecture, right? So we all have basic traits that makes us us. Now, let's talk a little bit more about these factors of personality. As you notice, I already used the term extraversion. Now, in a scientific sense, in a psychological sense, we define extraversion as a personality trait, right? A personality trait, a characteristic that remains consistent over time or across situations. And notice that this individual generally remains outgoing and sociable. Generally, this person is friendly. Generally, these individuals tend to pursue that social contact, right? Generally, these individuals tend to pursue that social interaction. Now, any questions about extraversion? Extraversion. Good deal. Generally, in a very basic sense, if you want to remember extraversion, remember that the 5-factor model of personality, this is just simply one of the methods that we can utilize to understand those basic traits that I was mentioning just earlier. So notice that a person who carries extraversion may have positive emotionality. Let's talk a little bit more about neuroticism, right? Neuroticism is the amount of anxiety, the individual's characteristics towards hostility, an individual's tendency to fall or remain self-conscious, and perhaps may exhibit more impulses, right? That person may exhibit impulses particularly related to those of emotion. Right? Now, notice that conversely, right, we have positive emotion when it comes to extraversion and negative emotion, right, towards neuroticism. So any questions about that? Any questions?
In this case, is the positive and the negative, is that more of a stand-in for like good, bad, or is it?
And that is a very, very good question. Does this mean that one is better than the other, that one is good or bad? Not necessarily, not necessarily, because these are characteristics that you have, right? Personality remains very consistent, right? You're going to have these characteristics when you're very young. Even as toddlers, you would see how children already have their little personalities. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're introverted, for example, that you are doing something bad or that it is wrong. So that's a really good question because a lot of people do see that way. And it doesn't mean because I am extroverted, I'm doing better in life, right? That's not necessarily what that means, but that is a really good question. Very, very good question. All right, let's move into another factor, right? Let's move into one of the big five, if you will. Openness to experience, openness to experiences. Basically, this is what I like to think of as being flexible, right? As being aware that things can change, right? That you're looking for change. So for example, these individuals are looking for intellectual pursuits, right? They generally have unconventional attitudes, right? So for example, these individuals are a little bit open to change, right? These individuals, I wouldn't say necessarily welcome change, but they're open to it, right? So for example, if say an individual, we don't know what causes the sky to be blue, right? There was a point we didn't have an idea what that was. Perhaps a person who was open to experience decided, I want to know, right? I want to know why these experiences, why these things happen. So these individuals tend to be a little bit more tolerant to not knowing, right? A lot of us have that concern. We like consistency, right? So for example, it gives us comfort to be consistent, right? So for example, I always wear business casual clothes, and then one day I decide to wear a costume, right? Like a T-Rex costume. You guys are going to be a little bit thrown off by that, right? Because I haven't remained consistent. But maybe I'm open to change. So that day was Halloween, and I decided to show up, and I'm open to that type of dialogue. Let's move into another factor. Let's move into another factor, and that is agreeableness. Agreeableness. This is when we find individuals who are sympathetic. These individuals tend to be very straightforward, right? This tends to be a characteristic that we can find with individuals that have empathy and helping behavior. This is when you find your physicians, medical doctors, therapists, nurses, teachers, individuals who generally work in fields that require compassion and that require to be cooperative with other individuals. One of the last traits that I want to talk about is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness. In this particular regard, these individuals are highly aware of some aspects that include self-discipline, right? The ability to be able to regulate oneself effectively. So for example, if I am conscientious, I know that I have to be in class at a certain amount of time, right? At a certain time, not because I'm going to get fired, but because if I am conscientious, I know that you guys are paying for this class. I know that you guys want to learn, hopefully, want to learn something about that class. So if I am a conscientious person, I'm going to try to be punctual. I'm going to try to be organized because that involves a sense of that self-discipline. And the same thing goes with you guys, right? So for example, if I provide an instruction of say, hey, make sure to read these slides for the chapter, you know that that involves a level of self-discipline if you are indeed conscientious. So any questions about that? Yes, sir.
Those like extra factors very I'm guessing there's, more depth to all of this stuff, each of those, listed characteristics. 'Cause
You're,
they seem very broad and sort of powerful.
you're absolutely right. That is a really good point. So notice that this is what we call the 5-factor model. It is very broad, but what this model is trying to illustrate is basically the generic basic characteristics that individuals will have, right? It does get more specific. Some individuals have taken it to 200 something factors, right? And I think that's too specific, right? That moves into the too specific range. But yeah, different models will cover different depth. This one is only illustrating basically the basic broad generalization of personality traits. It doesn't necessarily involve the more specific ones, but we will see that in other aspects of, for example, with the 16PF. Personality factors. Some of you might have even done that little assessment before. So you're absolutely right. It is pretty broad, but that's the intent of the model. It's just to cover very general aspects of personality. All right, so let's revert back to our slides. Now, you may be wondering, are there any differences, right? Are there any differences? Something you will find is that there is a slight difference between gender, right? Gender does tend to play a role, although ever so slightly, right? So for example, one of the more significant aspects in that modest increase, or I should say differences, is that females tend to score slightly higher, right? In the aspects of agreeableness and neuroticism, right? So for example, trying to pursue what other people are seeing, and for example, relaying more anxiety. Now, there are very interesting aspects of the 5-factor model of the Big Five, because there are some correlations, right? Some correlations between the 5 factors and life outcomes. So for example, individuals who report better grades tend to have better consciousness, tend to report higher states of conscientiousness. Now, individuals who are open to the arts, individuals who do have better achievement in the arts, not surprisingly, are more inclined to be open, right? Notice that career success, right, can also have an aspect as to which traits fit the demands for that job. For instance, an individual, you would expect someone who works in my field, right? Someone that works in my field should have some form of empathy towards others, right? So you would think that someone in my field will generally pursue a career that tends to be a little more close to agreeableness, right? So someone in my field will have agreeableness as a characteristic. So it wouldn't surprise you. It wouldn't surprise you that certain careers are indeed related to some personality traits. Yes, sir.
So are these?
That is a really good question. Can you change your personality? It is immensely difficult to change personality, right? Not only that, you may already have issues with personality, right? Such as narcissism, psychopathy. They are very consistent and they are very difficult to change. Can they be changed? Arguably, yes, but it will be immensely significant because remember, you have used your personality to inform your behavior, right? So you already feel comfortable, right? So if I were to tell an introverted person, hey, let's go hang out, let's go to the club, let's go to the party, let's go to this board game place, right? Is it going to feel comfortable for that person? Not necessarily, because they have already used this trait to inform their behavior for a very long time, probably since they were very, very young. Can you change it? Yes. Is it easy? Absolutely not. It is very, very difficult. Yes, ma'am.
Can trauma change personality?
Yes, trauma can be a factor that could impact your traits. So for example, I consider myself to be a very extroverted person who love to meet new people. I didn't care if they were down the street. It's like, hey, how you doing? Good morning, right? But then, for example, after combat exposure, I became a little bit more recluse, right? So the problem with that is that now I have a dilemma. I want to go out and hang out with people, but then it feels really uncomfortable to be outside, right? So especially if it's a place where I can think there's some danger, right? So notice now we have those two, right? I have completely different and conflicting traits, right? So yes, absolutely, it could happen for sure.
So you can't have conflicting traits?
Yes, absolutely, you sure can. And that is what we call a personality disorder. Absolutely, yes, that is true. All right. Good deal. Now, let's look at different schools of thought that allow us to understand personality. And of course, we have talked before about the school of thought of psychoanalytic theory. Now, remember, the psychoanalytic theory, as we've mentioned in very early lectures in this course and in previous lectures, remember that the psychodynamic theory came from Sigmund Freud, and in his particular case, he argued that your behaviors, that your traits, that your trauma came from unconscious mental forces, that it came from something that wasn't necessarily as visual or concrete as you may imagine. Now, how is it that we know these factors exist? Well, one of the things that psychodynamic theory proposed is that we needed to do psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis was simply the approach in which we would have lengthy verbal interactions with patients, during which we are going to look deeply into the patient's lives, right? We're going to look not at the surface, not at what the person is aware of, but perhaps what the person is not necessarily aware of or the unconscious. Generally, the psychoanalytic theory, its focus is to look at influences of early childhood, right? That's an immensely important factor of the psychoanalytic theory. And what it tries to do is look at those early childhood experiences. For example, what Dr. Nunez was mentioning, trauma, right? Trauma, experiences, events. How did you cope with something? How did you not cope with something? And those unconscious conflicts. Now, some of these conflicts can be sexual in nature, particularly sexual urges that you may have, right? So for example, the need to reproduce. Now, persons at the time where the psychodynamic theory was being presented, they were very uncomfortable. They were significantly uncomfortable with Freud's theories. Particularly, what they were really uncomfortable with is with the fact that Freud argued that you are not a master of your own mind, that you are not in control of what your mind does, because a lot of the behaviors that you engage in came from the unconscious, right? A lot of the behaviors came from the unconscious. And this is one of the examples that I like giving students. So for example, think about when you ask someone out, right? You think you're in control, right? You think you're in control about asking someone out and asking them on a date and, going to the movies, going for dinner. But notice that Freud argues not really in control of that. Those are your sexual unconscious urges telling you go on a date so you can reproduce, right? So he would argue that you're not in reality in control of your own destiny, that your own unconscious desires, that your instincts were indeed more responsible of your behavior than most other factors. So people were immensely uncomfortable on hearing that. Any questions about that? All right, let's move on to Freud's perception of personality. And again, some of the factors that he presented were not necessarily vindicated by research, but this is perhaps one of the few that was a little bit more substantiated by research. So according to Freud, the structure of your personality is related to your levels of awareness, right? He liked to use this illustration, right? He liked to use, we use currently this illustration because according to psychoanalysis, right? According to psychoanalysis, when we are investigating your unconscious, basically your consciousness is basically everything that you are aware of. So basically the very tip of that iceberg. So notice that the vast majority of your thoughts, the vast majority of your desires, the vast majority of your personality is under the surface, which is why if we revert to our previous slide, notice that it did require lengthy verbal interactions So we can move further deeply into your unconscious. Let's talk about which forces lead you into engaging in certain behaviors. Notice that the first one is the id, right? The id. This is a very primitive instinct that humans have, and it's a component of your personality. And this is basically the component of pleasure. So if you take nothing else from the id, I want you to equate id with pleasure, right? I want you to equate id with pleasure. Why is that? Because the id is going to be that driving force, that driving motivator that leads you into doing things that lead to comfort, that lead to pleasure. So for example, you asking someone out for a date may perhaps be led because of your id, because you're trying to gain some sort of pleasure. Notice that I use the sexual aspects because it's a little bit easy to understand. But I want you to think about anything that can lead you to pleasure. So for example, I'm going to steal this candy bar from my neighbor, right? The guy that's this piece of gum, right? So you gain a piece of food, right? That clearly is going to lead to pleasure because we have the instinct of survival and eating. So because we have an instinct of surviving, notice that the id is going to operate in your favor. It's going to say, well, go ahead and steal this because you need to eat, right? Now, notice that if we move a little bit further, right? If we move a little bit further, notice that we have a secondary process of thinking, right? Notice that that secondary process of thinking is what we refer to ego, your ego. Unfortunately, people use ego incorrectly in colloquial terms, but in psychological terms, particularly in the focus of psychodynamics, I want you to think about the ego is that aspect that operates in reality. Notice that the id is very deep. It's the pleasure principle, right? So for example, I should steal this piece of candy, the Snickers bar that's sitting next to me because I need to eat, right? I didn't have breakfast. But notice that the ego is that decision-making component of your personality and your awareness. And this process would say, should I steal it or should I not? Should I ask this person out on a date or should I not? Notice that this aspect is closer to the surface. And this is what we call the pre-conscious, the pre-conscious. What is the pre-conscious? The pre-conscious is just beneath the surface of what you can recall directly, right? Your contact with the outside world. And the pre-conscious, right? The pre-conscious, it's simply, right now, you may not necessarily be thinking actively about your pre-conscious. But if I were to say, go ahead and steal that Snickers bar that your neighbor left right next to you, you will say, well, no, I don't want to steal it. And then when you think about it, well, why not? It's like, well, because of, say, for example, XYZ reason that you don't want to steal it. So notice it's just beneath the surface of your consciousness. Notice that it did guide your behavior because you made a decision as to whether or not you were going to steal that Snickers bar, whether or not you were going to ask that person out on a date. So it's barely beneath the surface. And notice that the ego operates just beneath the surface, meaning that it's really easy to recall, right? If I ask you directly, why don't you want to steal that Snickers bar? Notice that it is relatively easy to recall it, right? To verbally express why. Now, the last aspect that I want to talk about is the superego, right? The superego. Notice that the superego does operate at the unconscious level, right? Just like the id. Id and the superego are behaving, occur under that unconscious level, right? They occur under that unconscious level. Notice that because they're on that unconscious level, they're difficult to retrieve. They're not as easy as that pre-conscious level or that conscious level, right? They're a little bit deeper in your level of awareness. Yes, sir.
Are these like actual parts of your brain or are they just like classifications? Like what are they?
So these are considered levels of awareness. If you remember in our previous chapter, we had consciousness, alert consciousness. This is basically the same, but explained through a psychodynamic perspective. So these are one of the few, I don't want to say few, But these are one of the factors that have been vindicated. So for example, just levels of awareness, just like being asleep or being awake or having conscious wakefulness or being drowsy. It's basically the same thing, but instead of alertness for personality, right? What guides your behavior? Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So we revert back to our presentation. You'll notice that because both the id and the superego are at the unconscious level, notice how they're also pretty much the opposite from one another. On the one hand, you have the id that is looking for pleasure, and then you have the superego. The superego is that moral component. Basically, we're trying to utilize social standards about what is right and what is wrong. Notice that this is instilled by those social standards. Notice that I like to mention that a whole lot because what is moral today may be immoral tomorrow. What was moral yesterday will be immoral today. Notice that it does change. It does change across societies and it is different over time. And a lot of people think, well, it's innate in a sense. Well, but remember that it is informed because of social standards. So those of you who are in sociology or philosophy, you know that those aspects will change over time, right? Because, for example, at some point, we thought that it was okay to own people as commodities, right? But we thought that that was okay, but we understand now that that is not okay to enslave a person because we're owning a person who has dignity as a commodity, just like I own this phone, right? So when this person has his or her agency. So any questions about that? In regards to how much does it impact, it will impact all of your decision making. So we'll go into your pre-conscious. So say, for example, if I were to tell you, go ahead and steal this candy bar because you haven't had breakfast, and then you say no, and I ask you, okay, well, no, well, because it's morally incorrect. So notice how it went from the very unconscious to the conscious side. So it is a little bit difficult to retrieve, but it's going to inform, say, for example, aspects of your pre-consciousness. So not necessarily just your unconscious. It does belong in the unconscious, but it can inform the rest of your behavior, for example, on the pre-conscious stage. So that's why that illustration looks, I can pull it up. Notice how if I were to ask you, go ahead and steal that candy bar, you will say, well, it's against my moral code, right? To steal. So yeah, it can affect the rest of your levels, for sure, your levels of consciousness. All right. Now, this is super interesting. I see this almost every day in practice. So what are these? These are defense mechanisms. What are defense mechanisms? Defense mechanisms are a natural way that your brain protects itself. A defense mechanism is a feature of your brain in which generally I'm trying to protect you. Your brain is trying to protect you from unpleasant aspects, right? Such as those aspects that lead you into anxiety, lead you to trauma, lead you to guilt. It is an active process of your brain to say, that doesn't feel good. Let me revert you back over here, where it is warm and fuzzy. It's simply your way of your body to protect itself. I like to compare defense mechanisms as your immune system, right? It's a really good way to visualize how defense mechanisms work. Because your brain, just like your body, when it is exposed to something foreign and something that could cause you harm, defense mechanisms, they do the same exact thing. They're trying to protect your mind into something that can cause anxiety or something that can cause severe discomfort. For example, trauma, right? So just like your immune system, whenever it's exposed to a foreign agent that causes discomfort, your brain will do the same, but for psychological events. So any questions about the definition and purpose of a defense mechanism? Good deal. Let's look at the most common ones that we can think of. There is a ton of different defense mechanisms, right? There is a wide variety, just like there is a lot of cells in your immune system that try to fight off agents that could cause you illness. The same happens for defense mechanisms. Let's look at rationalization, right? Rationalization. This is simply your brain trying to create a false but yet plausible excuse of unacceptable behavior. I'll give you an example. You have a patient, you have a client in your practice, and he or she would say, well, I cheated on my spouse because we never had sex. Okay, that is a plausible excuse, but it's perhaps not an accurate excuse, right? Because you could have, if that were the true reason, there's things we could have done to satisfy that sexual desire in your marriage. So notice, it's plausible, sure, but is it really the cause that led to cheating and being unfaithful in your marriage? Perhaps there's something else, right? Perhaps there's an issue with personality. Perhaps there's an issue with expectations, right? So notice that when we're trying to rationalize our behavior, generally we're also trying to justify something that's unacceptable. We're trying to justify something that's unacceptable. Notice that you can also see this with other people. So you'll see this quite a lot. For example, you'll have someone who commits a crime, right? This person committed a crime. It hurts a wide variety of individuals and survivors, but you'll hear the parents say, well, he only did that because he was depressed. Oh, he only attacked this person because that person made them mad. That's a really good way to rationalize an unacceptable behavior. Because remember that your brain is going to try to do whatever possible to remove those unpleasant emotions. So mom and dad would say, well, my son only did that because of X, Y, Z. That's easier than facing the consequences of those unpleasant emotions. For example, understanding that your son is a criminal or that your daughter is a criminal. So a defense mechanism will be an easier way to manage those aspects that can deal with anxiety and guilt. This one you might have seen in the past, repression. It's another defense mechanism, which is what we're trying to do is all of those distressing thoughts that cause anxiety and guilt and discomfort, severe discomfort. Notice that what we're trying to do is move these distressing thoughts to the unconscious. So if we revert back to our previous illustration, notice that here is the trauma, right? Here's where it happened. You were kidnapped, you were assaulted, you were in a car accident, right? Something that was anxiety producing or traumatic here in your consciousness. But remember that a defense mechanism works just like your immune system. So it's going to do whatever possible to remove this from your consciousness. Let's put it at a deeper level so it is difficult to retrieve, right? So it is difficult to retrieve. So notice that you were in a car accident and it was immensely traumatic. Notice that repression, what it's going to do is move it to a deeper level. So it is difficult for you to retrieve that memory. Yes, sir.
Do you do that on purpose with the knowledge that it will make you upset if you remember it, or you don't accident?
This is an involuntary automatic process of your brain. Your brain does this. You could do it actively, sure, but your brain would do it regardless. Just like if I expose it to a virus, your body's going to try to fight it, regardless if you try to fight it or not. I mean, sure, you can take Tylenol or something like that to fight that virus, but notice that this is an automatic process of your brain. This is an automatic process that occurs. I would argue that some people are better at certain defense mechanisms, but notice that this is a unconscious effort, right? Largely unconscious effort from your brain to try to protect you, just like your immune system protects you from a bacteria, right? So it's a largely unconscious effort. Now, this one you probably heard a lot. You see this a lot in social media. You're projecting, you're trying to project, right? Notice that with projection, I'm trying to attribute my own thoughts, my own desires, my own motives into another person. Notice that the person might have not even had that as a conscious effort, but you're saying, oh, you're only doing this because you're this. Is it really? Or is that you though? Like, are we really talking about the other person? Or are we really talking about you? That is another method of defense mechanisms. Yes, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. So in therapy, sometimes it is really difficult for individuals to tell you directly what the source of their trauma is. They might not be able to tell you, but they may be able to draw it, right? They may not be able to tell you, but they'll show it in play, right? And I'll give you an example. So I have a little client, he's 5. He is the cutest thing on the planet. God bless him, he is so cute. So he never wants to talk about a car accident, right? He never wants to talk about it. He was referred to me for ADHD. The thing about that though, is that ADHD looks exactly the same as trauma, right? A lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people think, oh, I just have ADHD. Well, surprisingly, the symptoms of trauma look exactly the same as ADHD, particularly with children. So for example, being distracted, not being able to focus, hyperactivity, talking really fast, right? Those are symptoms of trauma too. So if you put them side by side, you're going to check a couple boxes because they're similar. So whenever I have someone for ADHD, the first thing I try to do is rule out ADHD because chances are that's not the case. So with this child, consciously, it's really hard for the child to talk about a car accident. But a couple months ago, he was in a car accident with his family, and he is still very scared about this car accident, right? So notice he can't tell me about the car accident, but he can show me about the car. So we sit on the floor, we play with cars, and Dr. Shar's on the floor playing with him. But in reality, I am observing his unconscious efforts. So he can't tell me how much he's afraid of this car accident, but he can show me how afraid he is about that car accident. So you are right. That is one way we can do and analyze unconscious behavior. All right. Now, this is something really interesting when it comes to displacement. Displacement is also another form of a defense mechanism. And what we're trying to do is displace the emotions that came from that original source, and I'm going to find another target. And I'm sure a lot of you might have seen this before, either with yourselves or with friends, or with neighbors. So say, for example, dad is angry, right? Dad is angry at his boss. And dad cannot yell at his boss, right? Because what would happen? Dad's probably gonna get fired. So what he will do is whenever he gets home, he starts yelling at the dog, yelling at the kids, yelling at the wife, yelling at the plants. He just yells at everything, right? Might hit someone, right? Notice that the only reason this person is doing that is because it is too real to accept. You can't have this anger with your boss. You are in no control because this person generally is in a higher position than you. So you can't yell at your boss, but you can yell at your kids. You can yell at your boss, but you can yell at your wife, vice versa, right? Wife is angry, wife got mad at work, so she can't yell at her boss, but then she'll go home and slap her kids. That is a form of displacement because I am moving that source of emotion from that original source. Now I'm moving it to another source. Generally speaking, the book doesn't mention that, but generally speaking, that displacement occurs with someone or something that you view lesser than you. So for example, you can't hit your boss, but you go home and hit your cat, right? Because you can see how you have displaced that anger to something that you perceive that is a little bit lower. Any questions about that? Yes, sir.
So, what is, because I mean, like there's a lot of things, how often is it that people use multiple of them either for the same thing, or like how is it decided which methods to use, or what combination, or basically what is that process, or what dictates doing what?
The process is, of course, natural, right? It occurs naturally. It's largely unconscious. Generally, your brain is going to pick the one that is better at moving things to your unconscious. So perhaps displacement is not the best method, but maybe repressing is the best method, right? So for example, you've been in a car accident and perhaps displacing the fear and anger that you have about that car accident is not adequate, but repression is. So it's a natural process. It's based on whichever method can move it to the unconscious better and easier, right? So in a car accident, perhaps displacement is not the best one, but repression is, right? So for example, with that 5-year-old patient, displacement.
So learn thing kind of deal.
So remember, personality is long-term. I would argue that whatever has worked for you is going to be the method that you're going to sustain, right? So if it has worked for me to say, for example, exploit people since I was a kid, perhaps I'm going to be a really good narcissist when I become older, right? Or psychopathic. So it's simply the method that has worked best for you as well. Which one has worked best for you? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that just because, sometimes you come against something that, those strategies don't work and now you're, more depressed or whatever, and you can't deal with it as well, but then you get better at doing that.
Right. And you're absolutely right. You get better at doing worse, right? And that's exactly what therapy is for. You're getting better at doing worse. So when you go to therapy, you want to get better at doing better. So for example, facing the trauma, right? Instead of it being in the unconscious, we want to bring it up to the conscious so that you can develop coping mechanisms, right? So the problem with defense mechanisms is that they're simply, I would argue, they are a natural band-aid, right? Just like your immune system. Your immune system can only take care of an agent for so long before you actually have to start seeking help. And the same thing goes with defense mechanisms. They can only take care of trauma or anxiety producing effects for so long before you're actually going to start seeing manifested in other areas. So for example, in psychological illnesses, right? The person starts developing depression because they have repressed a trauma, right? So it can only last for so long before you actually have to start seeking for other types of help, i.e. coping mechanisms, exposure therapy, things of that nature. Now, another interesting aspect is reaction formation. Now, you start behaving in an opposite aspect to what your true feelings actually are. I like to think about individuals who may show themselves as homophobic. So they may start engaging in behaviors that are detrimental for people for the LGBT, but in reality, they're only forming a reaction based on their own behavior. I'm not saying all people who are homophobic are like that. I'm saying that could be an example. Now, this one, regression. Regression is super interesting, especially when you see it in person, which is really cool to see it. So this is when an individual is going to go back to an immature pattern of behavior. What does that mean? Think about one time that you were arguing, right? You're arguing with someone, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your boo, with your bae, whichever, right? You're arguing with someone, and all of a sudden, you start using like what I like to call Mickey Mouse voice. It's okay, baby, you'll be just fine, right? That is a form of regression because you're grown. You talk like a grown man. You talk like a grown woman, right? But notice that now you're using a child's voice. Why is that? Because the anxiety of arguing with this person is just too great. So because of that, what you're trying to do is regress to another aspect in which you felt more comfortable. So for example, when you were a little baby, talking with that little Mickey Mouse voice. So seeing it in action is immensely interesting. I do have clients that don't even, and generally we don't even see these, right? So think about, I have a client, she is 17, 18. And generally, we are talking about emotions directly. It's kind of hard for her to let me know about her emotions. And one day I decided, let's go to the playroom. Right? Let's go to the playroom. And sure enough, when she just started grabbing the toys and playing, she regressed back. She regressed back to an age that she felt more comfortable. Notice that this is because the coping mechanisms that you had then, that's as far as you could handle. So that's one of the reasons why people go and regress to an earlier stage. Any questions about regression? Good deal. One of the last things that I'd like to cover about defense mechanisms is notice that we are trying to do identification. And what I'm trying to do is basically trying to form an imaginary or real alliance with a group of people simply for the intent of bolstering my own self-esteem. So notice that you may be engaging in something that's anxiety producing, i.e. not having any self-esteem. Now I'm going to find a group of individuals that perhaps exist or not. It's like, oh, these people understand me. These people know what I'm about, right? When in reality, Are you truly looking for that compassion and sense of camaraderie? Or is it because you're simply trying to boost your own self-esteem? Right? And in reality, sometimes it does fall back into that sense of self-esteem. Yes, sir.
This is why like cults always target people on that like edges.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Is it group and stuff like that?
Okay, so the question was cults. Cults operate in a really interesting fashion. I would argue it's not just that, it's a whole variety, right? And you could say yes, right? Remember that behavior is super complicated, right? So I don't want to attribute, oh, cults operate just on this fashion, right? But notice if I have a sense of group and unison, that is indeed going to help me. But is it really hoping, or is it really that I'm trying to exploit your self-esteem? So I would argue yes, although there's many components, but that would be an aspect to consider for sure. Let's talk about the development, the psychosexual development. Now, this, as I was mentioning earlier, Freud would love to engage in this particular aspect because he would consider that a lot of your personality is indeed affected because of your sexual development, right? Now, Freud argued that your development had to deal with your ability to resolve issues at these specific stages, right? So let's talk a little bit more about the oral stage. Freud would argue that during this time, we had an erotic focus. And when you hear erotic, think about what caused pleasure, what satisfied a need. So for example, during this time, what caused an erotic focus was, say, for example, sucking on a bottle, on a pacifier, on, say, for example, being breastfed, say, for example, biting. So a lot of the focus had a lot to do with the focus on the mouth. Freud would argue that persons who were or were not satisfied, that their erotic focus was not satisfied, then they were going to have a focus on their personality. So for instance, individuals that would overcome this space, so for example, from eating from a breast or a bottle, if they were not satisfied during that time, say, for example, those are individuals that talk way too much because they find pleasure and excitement and relief by using their mouth. So he would argue, okay, these are individuals that talk too much, or individuals who talk very little, right, that don't express their emotions. Now, let's move into the anal stage. You have heard this before. You might have had people who would say, oh, you're just too anal, she's super anal, right? This is where that comes from, right? From the psychosexual stages of development and their impact towards adult personality. So Freud would argue that during this time, the focus of pleasure, the focus of having a sense of relief came from the anus. He would argue that that would come either from expelling or retaining excrement or feces. So how would that work according to Freud? A person, right, a person who would retain, for example, a young child at the age of 2, notice that this person could exert a form of control, right? So for example, if the person, say the parents and the kid is excreting extensively or not excreting correctly, notice that this person is engaging in a form of control. Because now you have to pay attention to me. Now you have to pay attention because I haven't gone to the bathroom. So he would argue that the form to address this concern was through toilet training, the ability of that person to be able to use the toilet. He would argue that individuals who would retain are individuals who are excessively trying to retain control. So whenever you've heard the phrase, oh, this guy's too anal or this lady's too anal, what that refers to is not being able to resolve that psychosocial stage that later impacted the person's personality. So for instance, they try to be very controlling and demanding later on in adulthood. Notice that later on, Freud would argue that children move around the age of 3 and 5 to the focus of erotic emphasis through the genitals. Yes, sir.
Is this one of the things that's still believed, or is this one that's crazy?
This was discredited, in case you guys were wondering. It's like, we don't necessarily, this is, the thing about, we do teach this, it did provide, why do we still teach it? Well, because it still provides an aspect of how early childhood can impact later development. But notice that the aspects of trying to support this model are very slim, right? The research to support it is very slim. Now, if we revert back to our presentation, notice that according to him, what would happen is that children between the ages of 3 and 5 years old have a focus on their genitals. Generally, this is when children start noticing and start fondling their own bodies, right? So boys start playing with their, I should say, on quotes, with their penises, and girls start exploring their vaginas. And that is because they are trying to identify adult, according to Freud, they were trying to identify adult role models and attempting to cope with the crisis of Oedipus. So who can tell me if any of you are familiar with that? Yes, sir.
There's a Greek play about a guy who, there was a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. So to avoid that, some bunch of stuff happened, but he ended up like trying to move to a different town. And along the way, he killed a guy and it turned out to be his father. And he married the widow, turned out to be his mother. It was a big prophecy. You can't hide from prophecy a little bit.
So according to Freud, adult children, male children, would have to try to resolve the Oedipal crisis. And what was the Oedipal crisis? He would argue that, just like he noted, male children were in love with their mothers, and they would try to use the role model of their moms, of their mothers, to inform their own sexual practices as adults. So for example, that's something you'll hear every now and then. And some people will say, well, he's just trying to marry his mom, right? He's just trying to marry his mom, right? He wants to find a wife that's just like his mom. And Freud would argue that that came because of a conflict, that you wanted to have sex with your mother, right? That you wanted to have sex with your mother. And that is why, because you can't have sex with your mother, because it wouldn't be socially acceptable, the next best thing would be finding a female who represented the things that you found in your mother. So for example, if you thought your mother was caring or nurturing or beautiful, then the next best thing, well, you can't marry your mother and you can't kill your dad. So the next best thing would be, okay, well, let me find someone that has those characteristics. And like I said, not vindicated by research. There was something similar with females, and that was a complex of Electra. Anybody has heard that before? Complex of Electra. So it's very similar to the Oedipus sense. You might have not heard of the complex of Electra, but you might have heard about penis envy. I might have heard about that term before. So Freud would argue that females, as children, when they're 3 and 5, he would argue that females felt insufficient, that they felt like second-class citizens, basically, because they didn't have a penis. So he would argue, well, I become angry because I don't have a penis and I'm not as strong as my father, right? So instead of trying to marry their dads, right, you can't kill your mom, so I'm going to identify with my mother. That's why Freud would argue that females will have a close bond with their moms, because I can be as strong as that, so therefore, let me align with my mom. Let me form an allegiance, right? Because according to him, that's the next best thing. You can't marry your dad and you can't be as strong as that because you don't have a penis. So because of that penis envy, then they would identify with their moms. Now, Freud did a lot of cocaine back in his day. That's just a fact. Like, you can just Google this. Like, you don't need to believe me. Freud did a whole lot of cocaine, which, I mean, we have a lot to credit him for, in the sense that he did try, though. You know what I'm saying? Like, he gets an A for effort. Like, he was trying to explain a lot of aspects of personality, but he gets an A for effort, though, not necessarily for actual research, right? Because he did it. He didn't do a lot of research. That's why we have to come in. It's like, let me look into that Electra and that Oedipus complex. So that did happen. But let's move on to our next stage. Now, in his regard, he would argue that later in latency, which was between 6 and 12, there are simply no oppressed sexual desires. Basically, we have become repressed. So he argued that during that latency stage, between 6 and 12, there's nothing happening. We know that that's not true. There's a whole lot happening between the ages 6 and 12. So we know that that's actually not true. Now, when we move towards the general stage, right, the general stage, notice that what he's trying to illustrate is that we're going to move from that suppressed latent stage, and what you're trying to do is expanding on social contracts, right? So now it's not like you're wanting to have sex with your mom, you're not trying to identify with that and having penis envy. Notice that now, according to Freud, it's like, so now you're going to start learning those roles, what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman. So during those ages is when you start to understand social contracts, social norms, specifically when it came to sexual behaviors, right? And then later on, when we're talking about the genital stages, notice that what he was mentioning is now we're actually going to have sex. Now we're actually going to become sexually intimate. And the point of the genital stage, which is generally basically puberty and onward, was you're trying to establish intimate relationship, right? You're trying to contribute to society. So notice that you're moving from that initial nuclear family relationship, and now you're moving towards a societal relationship. So any questions about that? So notice that a lot of people were not particularly interested in Freud because he simply didn't have the research to substantiate it, right? This was simply a person who, although well-intentioned, I would argue, perhaps, he was more towards the right direction into not attributing mental health and personality to woo-woo, it just happens, right? He was trying to move towards the right direction. Like, oh, maybe we need to do some research about this, guys, I don't know. But because he didn't do a lot of research, he did have students and he did have people under him that decided, okay, let me revise these theories. Let me study a little bit further. And this is where we see Carl Jung. Now, in his particular sense, he did agree with Freud. Carl Jung did agree with Freud that there was a level of unconscious. He did argue in that sense. And we do today. We do understand that there is a level of consciousness. Now, what Jung would argue is that each person has both conscious and unconscious levels of awareness. However, he added something else. He added something else to Freud's understanding of the conscious and the unconscious, which is Jung proposed that the entire human race, all of us, share a collective unconscious. A collective unconscious. This was immensely important because he would argue that within that collective unconscious, we store ancestral memories, right? So for example, archetypes. And some of you might have heard this term before. And what does that mean? Well, he argued that across societies, we find the same themes, right? We find a hero. We find a villain. We have an idea of God, right? So all cultures, you'll find, say, for example, people know what a hero is. People know what a villain is. People know or have a general idea of what God is. And he would argue that the only reason we have that collectiveness is because we have these ideas, not because of something supernatural, but because we have a collective unconscious, right? That has been passed down through our genes, basically as a method of survival, right? So if we know collectively what a hero is, if we know collectively what a villain is, there's many other archetypes, but I do like using this at first. He would argue that the only reason we share this across cultures is because we have a collective unconscious, right? We have a collective unconscious. So any questions about that?